Welcome to Scary Mary. Find a quiet place, get comfortable, and let your body begin to unwind. Here, true crime stories are told softly to help you drift between fear and calm. These are scary stories for brave dreams. If you enjoy this dark kind of piece, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. The silence on the Gunness farm in those autumn days of 1930 was special, thick, ringing, like a taut string. It was broken only by the creaking of the branches of the century-old oak by the porch and the rare shouts of Bella giving orders to her sons. But even these sounds drowned in the abyss of autumn silence, as if the farm was holding its breath, awaiting something inevitable. Belle Gunness, the mistress of these lands, felt this tension with every cell of her tired body. She was approaching 60, and each of those years was burned onto her face by the harsh Long Island winters and the scorching summer sun. She was not tall, but she carried herself with such unshakable confidence that she seemed like a giant. Her hands, strong and sinewy, with earth forever ingrained in the skin, could milk a cow, slaughter livestock, and repair a plow. And her eyes, perceptive and cold, saw right through anyone who dared to cross the threshold of her domain. Her life was built with iron discipline, rising before dawn, when the world was plunged into thick, velvety darkness. The first steps on the creaking kitchen floor, lighting the stove, quiet, business-like conversations with her sons, then a long day of working the land, which she knew better than the lines on her own palms. Every capricious tree in the garden, every sagging board in the fence, every stream changing its course after a downpour. Here she was the absolute queen, and her word, spoken in a quiet but firm voice, was law. She was frugal to the point of stinginess. Every cent had to be justified. Every penny had to bring profit. She distrusted banks, preferring the old-fashioned, reliable method, keeping her savings where she could see and touch them. Across the farm and the surrounding area, stubborn rumors persisted that a whole fortune was hidden in her house, in a secret place. These talks, like a light fog, hung in the air, but no one could confirm them, and no one dared to ask Bella herself. She was respected, but also feared. Her gaze revealed a steel will that brooked no argument, and so her life would have flowed, measured and predictable, from dawn to dusk, from spring to winter, if not for one circumstance. A farm is not just land and harvest, it is endless, exhausting labor, which was becoming increasingly beyond her strength as the years passed. Her sons helped, but they needed an extra pair of strong male hands, the hands of a hired worker. And then, on one utterly unremarkable day, he appeared on her doorstep. A man from another world, a man of mystery, whose appearance, as we now know, became the first domino in a long chain that led to catastrophe. His name was Otto Sanu, a drifter, a handyman, one of thousands like him, wandering from farm to farm in search of food and shelter. He was mute, or pretended to be. His past was shrouded in darkness. Where he came from, where he was headed, no one knew. He simply appeared like an autumn leaf brought by the wind, silent and otherworldly. Bella, with her characteristic practicality, assessed his sturdy build and calm, almost detached gaze, and agreed to take him on. He would work on the farm, and she would provide him with food and shelter in a small, dilapidated house on the very edge of the property. A simple business agreement. No personal connections, no attachments. That's how it was at first. Otto worked silently, diligently, almost never raising his eyes. He became part of the landscape, as integral as the old plow rusting by the barn, or the well with its cold, clean water. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, something began to change. Something in the very atmosphere of the farm, in the air its inhabitants breathed. Something in Bella's attitude, perhaps, in her eternal loneliness, in her deep, subconscious fear of the outside world. She began to see in this silent, illiterate worker not just a pair of hands, but some semblance of protection, a shield from a hostile reality, or, on the contrary, did his constant, silent presence begin to eat away at her from the inside like rust, reminding her of her vulnerability, of the fact that she, an aging woman, lived alone on the outskirts with a man whose past she knew absolutely nothing about. These questions, these quiet, creeping doubts, began to poison the farm's peace, like a poison slowly seeping into the groundwater. Neighbors, rare guests, began to notice that Bella had become even more withdrawn, even more sharp and intolerant, and the nights on the Gunness farm, already dark due to the absence of close neighbors, seemed to grow deeper, quieter, and because of that, even more sinister. And then, one day, closer to the end of 1930, Otto Sanu disappeared. He left as quietly as he had arrived, without a goodbye, leaving behind no trace, except for a sudden emptiness and a multitude of unanswered questions hanging in the cold autumn air. At first, Bella even seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The tension that had built up over months was gone. Her kingdom belonged only to her and her sons again. The ensuing silence at first seemed like a blessing, but it soon became clear that this peace was deceptive. It was not the silence of tranquility, but the silence before the storm. Oppressive, dense, filled with unspoken expectations and a growing, snowballing anxiety. It was at this time like an echo coming through the thickness of water that the first, most timid rumors began to creep from the neighboring farms. Where did that worker go? The mute one, farmers asked each other. Meeting at the store, strange that he left without his pay. Bella always paid on time, stingy, but honest. And haven't you noticed? A third would join in, lowering his voice, that on the Gunness farm sometimes at night, especially after he disappeared, there's such a strange, bright fire, not like in a stove, but like a bonfire, a big bonfire. These questions, still quiet as a whisper, already carried the seed of great trouble. A seed that, falling on the fertile soil of fear and distrust, would soon sprout and bear its terrible, poisoned fruit. And at night, if one listened closely, on the farm one could hear not only the howling of the wind, but also a muffled, monotonous sound. The scrape of a shovel, biting into the damp, unyielding earth, a sound that seemed like it would last forever. The winter on Long Island that year was especially harsh. An icy wind from the sound swept across the snow-covered fields, howling in the cracks of the barns, and making the window panes in the houses tremble with a fine, nervous shudder. But on the Gunness farm, there was its own internal cold, independent of the weather outside. It emanated from Bella herself, from her sudden withdrawnness, and from that strange, almost feverish glint that had appeared in her eyes. The rumors, which in autumn had been merely a timid whisper, with the onset of winter, grew stronger and gained force. They no longer just crept, they flew around the district, acquiring new, frightening details. Now they spoke not only of the missing worker. Now they recalled Bella's previous husband, who had also died under mysterious circumstances. They whispered that the land on the Gunness farm was somehow ungrateful, barren, yet all too generous with sudden deaths and the strange fire, which neighbors occasionally saw in the night, now burned more often. It wasn't the steady light of a kerosene lamp in a window, but precisely the restless, living flame of a bonfire, tearing shreds of black, acrid smoke from the darkness. This smoke was special, thick, with a sharp, chemical smell that was unlike the smell of burning wood or burnt leaves. It drifted through the hollows, clung to the bare branches of trees, and hung in the frosty air for a long time, as if unwilling to dissipate. Bella, if any of the rare guests dared to ask her about this fire, would brush it off. Burning trash, she would say shortly, and her gaze would become sharp as a blade. Old boards, junk, winter's the best time. But her words held such unshakable confidence that they gave rise to more questions than answers. What kind of trash could burn so often and so fiercely? And why only at night, as if hiding from prying eyes? Her sons, when caught in town, would only shrug reluctantly. "Mother knows what she's doing," they would say, avoiding the interlocutor's gaze. It was clear that they themselves were under Bella's strong influence, that her will for them was law, not subject to discussion. Their behavior hinted not just at obedience, but at some hidden anxiety, as if they themselves were afraid of what was happening on their own farm. And meanwhile, that very acrid smoke, seen by the neighbors, was doing its work. It didn't just hang in the air. It soaked into clothing, into hair, into the very walls of the Gunness house. It became an integral part of the atmosphere of this place, its soul, its sinister perfume. Passers-by who happened to be near the farm later told how the entire property, the very earth, gave off a faint but persistent smell of smoke and something else, something they couldn't describe, something Swedish nauseating that tickled the nostrils and caused an inexplicable unease. It was this smell that finally attracted the attention not of the neighbors, but of a man for whom such oddities were not a subject for gossip, but a reason for an official investigation. The local constable, making his rounds of the district, passed the Gunness farm several times, and each time caught this strange, alarming aroma. He knew the rumors. He remembered the story of the missing worker, which hadn't attracted much attention at the time. Drifters often left without notice, but now this combination, a missing person, persistent rumors, and this incomprehensible, obsessive smell of smoke, formed an alarming picture. One cold morning, when the sky was lead gray and low, he directed his horse towards Belle Gunness's house. This wasn't an official visit, no, just a friendly chat for now, an attempt to clarify the situation. He saw Bella on the porch. She was cleaning something, and her hands moved sharply, almost furiously. Seeing the constable, she froze, and her eyes, always so hard, for a moment betrayed something else. A quick, flash-like fear, immediately extinguished by her usual severity. "What can I do for you, constable?" she asked, and her voice sounded even, but far too tense. The constable took off his cap, greeted her politely, and, as if in passing, asked if she needed any help. "They say you've lost a worker, Otto, I believe. Should we file a missing persons report?" Bella shook her head sharply. "No report needed. He's gone, and good riddance. He was a lazy drunkard. I can manage on my own. And this smoke at night, Mrs. Gunness, the neighbors are worried. Fires, you know, are a dangerous business." And then Bella smiled. It wasn't a kind smile, but a sort of terrible, strained smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I already told you, I'm burning trash. A lot has piled up. It's not your concern, constable, what I burn on my own land." She stood on the porch, not inviting him in, and her figure in the dark dress seemed like a monolith, carved from the very gloom of that winter season. The constable felt an icy wall that he couldn't overcome with polite inquiries. He rode away, but the feeling of anxiety didn't leave him. He understood one thing. Something was happening on the Gunness farm, and Bella was trying her best to hide it. And the most terrible thing you can do with evil is to lock it within four walls and pretend it doesn't exist. Sooner or later, it will find a way out. And as subsequent events showed, that way out was already very close. The winter grew harsher, and with the frosts, the constable's suspicion hardened. What had begun as a vague unease was now turning into an obsession. The smell of smoke from the Gunness farm pursued him even in town. He fancied this acrid, Swedish trail in his own house, in his morning coffee. He replayed his short conversation with Bella in his head again and again. Her tense posture, that momentary, wild fear in her eyes, replaced by stony impenetrability, and that terrible, insincere smile. He began to act methodically, as befits a lawman. Without a formal pretext for a search, he could only observe and ask questions. He rode to the neighbors, those who lived half a mile from the Gunness farm, and everywhere he heard the same thing. Yes, there was smoke, and not just once. Always late at night. And the smell, everyone noted this strange chemical smell, which was unlike the smell of burning wood. One farmer, whose land bordered Bella's, told how once, riding late in the evening along her fence, he had seen not just a bonfire, but something like an improvised oven built from old bricks, and near it, a bustling figure. It was her, Bella, the farmer said confidently. I recognized her by her gait. She was throwing something into the fire, something large, and it seemed heavy. Meanwhile, a strange, dual atmosphere reigned on the farm. Outwardly, everything remained as before. Bella ran the household with an iron hand. The sons carried out her orders. But a kind of feverish haste had appeared in the rhythm of life, especially after dark. During the day, Bella could seem calm, even calmer than usual. But by evening, a nervousness appeared in her movements, and her gaze turned more and more often to the window, towards that very secluded corner of the property where she usually burned her trash. She became suspicious to the point of paranoia. If an unfamiliar wagon passed on the road, she would freeze and watch it, unblinking, until it disappeared from view. She checked the locks on the doors several times a night. Her sons, already silent, seemed to have completely lost the power of speech, answering their mother's questions monosyllabically and with downcast eyes. They did all the hard work around the farm, but their eyes showed not just fatigue, but a deep, soul-numbing depression, as if they were not willing helpers, but convicts on a chain gang, chained to this sinister land. And then, on one particularly frosty night, when the stars in the sky seemed like shards of ice and the air burned the lungs, the constable could bear it no longer. He couldn't wait any longer. There were still no official grounds for a warrant, but his professional instinct, his gut, screamed that something monstrous was happening behind the fence of the Gunness farm. He decided to make an unauthorized foray, ordering his deputy to wait for him on the road. He alone, sneaking like an Indian, made his way through the bare, crackling frozen hazel bushes that separated him from Bella's domain. He walked against the wind, so any dogs wouldn't catch his scent, and soon the very smell that had haunted him for weeks became thick and tangible. It flowed towards him, enveloping him, seeping under his clothes. The constable moved at random, guided only by this foul beacon. And soon he saw it. Not an open bonfire, but precisely that same pile of bricks the neighbor had mentioned. It stood in a small hollow, hidden from prying eyes by scrawny winter trees. From it poured that same acrid, oily smoke which, rising, merged with the low night sky. Hiding behind the thick trunk of an old elm, the constable watched. No one was around. Apparently, Bella had finished her night work and gone into the house. Slowly, trying not to make noise, he crept to the very edge of the brick structure. Heat still radiated from it in waves. The ground around was black, as if scorched by acid. The constable bent down and, removing a glove, ran his hand over the ground. His fingers touched something hard, half-burnt. He picked up the object. It was a metal belt buckle, cheap, tarnished by fire, but still recognizable. And nearby lay a piece of leather, burned beyond recognition, resembling a fragment of a sole from a rough boot. The constable's heart hammered somewhere in his throat. He looked around and saw a shovel stuck in the ground not far away. Next to it, a patch of soil looked freshly dug, loose, contrasting with the trampled, frozen earth around. He walked over and thrust the shovel into this spot. The ground gave way easily, too easily. He dug again and again. At a depth of just under a meter, the iron of the shovel grated against something hard and bulky. He cleared the earth with his hands, and the moonlight fell on what was hidden beneath. It wasn't a stone. It was a mass of fused, charred bones. They were black, fragile, and among them white teeth were visible. The skull was badly damaged by fire, but its shape left no doubt. These were human remains. The constable recoiled, barely suppressing a gag reflex. He realized he was looking at a makeshift grave, and he realized he had found the missing Otto Sanu. But the most terrible thing wasn't that. The most terrible thing was the scale of the find. The bones weren't in one place. He began to dig further, with desperate, feverish energy, and with each new movement of the shovel, new fragments, new charred bones emerged from the earth. There were too many for one person. Far too many. The grave he had dug up was not a single one. It was a mass grave. And in that moment, kneeling by the gaping pit in the frozen earth, under the cold, indifferent gaze of the winter stars, the constable, with soul-chilling clarity, realized that Belle Gunness had not been burning trash all this time. She had been burning corpses. And she was burying what was left of them here, on her own land, right under the windows of her own house. The silence around him was no longer just an absence of sound. It was filled with the voices of her victims, and he, finally, could hear them. Kneeling by the gaping pit, the constable felt the reality around him crack and unravel like rotten fabric. The cold night air, just a minute ago merely frosty, now seemed thick and viscous with the stench of death and deceit. The stars, cold and indifferent, were now not just celestial bodies, but mute witnesses to the nightmare he had just uncovered. He looked at the charred bones, at the teeth whitening in the moonlight, at the very buckle he held in his hand, and his mind desperately tried to assemble these horrifying pieces into a single picture. But the picture was so monstrous it wouldn't fit in his head. He hadn't just found Otto Sanu's body. He had found a warehouse of deaths, a warehouse of human remains treated like garbage, burned in a makeshift oven and buried in a shallow, almost disrespectful grave. The depth of the pit spoke of haste, of a desire to quickly hide the evidence, of utter contempt for those whose lives had been ended here. The thought of Belle Gunness, that severe, yet seemingly understandable farm woman, now evoked a chilling horror. This woman didn't just kill. She systematically destroyed the traces of her crimes, turning her victims into ash and smoke, which for weeks, for months, had poisoned the air of the district, while people dismissed it as burning rubbish. The cynicism and cold-bloodedness behind this were beyond human comprehension. Adrenaline made him act. He no longer thought about procedures, about warrants. He crawled away from the pit, trying not to leave traces, and with quick, silent steps headed back to the road where his deputy was waiting. The constable's face, illuminated by the dim light of a lantern, was pale as a sheet. "What happened?" the deputy asked anxiously, seeing him. "Ride to the station." The constable's voice was hoarse and broken. "Wake everyone. We need people, lots of people. And a doctor. Tell them we found bodies at the Gunness place. Not one, many." While the deputy galloped off in a panic, the constable returned to his observation post. He couldn't leave this place unguarded. He sat, his back pressed against the rough bark of the elm, and watched the dark, silent house of Bella. The windows were black, no movement. It seemed incredible that there, behind those walls, slept a woman who knew what was happening in her backyard. Knew it down to the last bone, the last tooth. He imagined her getting up in the morning, brewing coffee, looking at the spot where he had just been digging, and living with that knowledge. The thought was almost unbearable. Several hours passed, the longest of his life. The sky in the east began to lighten, staining dirty gray tones. And then the clatter of hooves and the creak of wagons was heard on the road. Reinforcements had arrived, several constables, the sheriff, and a doctor with his black bag. Their faces were serious, disbelieving. But when they approached the constable, and he, silently, pointed his hand at the excavated pit, disbelief turned to shock, and then to quiet horror. "Lord Jesus," whispered the sheriff, taking off his hat and running a hand over his face. "What in God's name is this?" Work began to boil. Now no one stood on ceremony. 2 constables headed to the house to question Bella and her sons. The others, under the doctor's direction, began carefully, layer by layer, to clear the sinister pit. With every new bucket of earth extracted, the picture became clearer and more monstrous. The bones weren't just lying in a jumble. They were laid out, economically, if such a word could even be applied here. Larger bones, femurs, humeri, in one corner, ribs in another, skulls and fragments of pelvic bones in a third. This wasn't a mass grave in a chaotic sense. This was disposal, a bone warehouse. The doctor, kneeling on a spread-out tarpaulin, carefully sorted through the finds. His face was concentrated and grim. "The fire," he said quietly. "Very high temperature. But not a crematorium furnace, no. This is something crude. Oil, possibly kerosene, was used to maintain the heat. Look," he lifted a fragment of a rib. "Here are impact marks before the fire. With an axe, something heavy." He set the rib aside and took one of the skulls, the most intact one. Fracture of the parietal bone. Fatal. And this one. He took another, bullet entry wound in the occipital region. Small caliber. Meanwhile, the constables who had approached the house were already knocking on the door. The knock echoed through the morning silence, hollow and ominous. A minute passed, then another. Finally, the door opened. Belle Gunness stood on the threshold. She was already dressed, her hair pulled into her usual tight bun. Her face was a mask of calm, but her eyes, those piercing eyes, betrayed her. They darted from the constables' faces to the group of people by the hollow, and in them was read not just tension, but something wild, animal, cornered. "Mrs. Gunness," one of the constables began, trying to speak as neutrally as possible. "We need you to come with us. There are questions." "Not now," she cut him off, trying to slam the door. "I'm busy." "I'm afraid this isn't a request." The constable put his shoulder to the door. "You can come voluntarily." At that moment, footsteps were heard from the depths of the house. Her sons appeared on the threshold. They stood, their eyes downcast, their postures expressing the deepest dejection. They didn't look at their mother, didn't look at the constables. They looked at the floor, as if hoping it would swallow them. "Mother," one of them said quietly, but said no more. Bella turned to them, and for a moment, something like despair flickered across her face, but it was immediately replaced by her habitual hardness. "Be quiet," she hissed. "Not a word. You know nothing." That phrase was enough. The constables took Bella and her sons into custody. They were led to the wagons to be taken to the station for questioning. Bella walked with her head held high, her back straight as an iron rod. She did not look back at the pit gaping on her land. She looked straight ahead, into the gray, advancing dawn. But in her departure, there was no righteousness, but a soul-chilling alienation, as if everything happening had nothing to do with her. And on the farm, the work was only beginning. The news of the find spread like wildfire. A crowd of onlookers gathered, who had to be held back by a cordon. Reporters from New York newspapers, already scenting a sensation, besieged the sheriff with questions. But the most terrible thing was yet to come. If there is one grave, there could be others. The sheriff ordered a sweep of the entire farm territory. Dozens of people with probes and shovels lined up in a chain and began methodically examining every square inch of land, and the land began to reveal its secrets. First reluctantly, then more and more often. Someone shouted, having thrust a probe into the soft earth by the old barn. Another pit. They dug it up, more bones there. Then they found a third in the vegetable garden, under supposedly winter-ready beds. A fourth under a pile of manure. A fifth right under the kitchen window. By noon that day, the count was already in the dozens. The Gunness farm, this once quiet, peaceful place, turned out to be a giant cemetery. Not a place of rest, but a place of destruction. Every new sinister harvest extracted from the earth screamed one and the same thing. Here, in this seemingly idyllic corner of Long Island, for years, a cold-blooded, methodical killer had been at work. And all the evidence, all the horrifying finds, pointed inexorably to one single woman, Belle Gunness, the queen of this kingdom of death. But to understand the scale of her atrocities, an even more terrible task lay ahead: to identify her victims. And that turned out to be the most difficult task of all. Word of the farm of death in Kings Park exploded not only across Long Island, but all of New York. Newspaper headlines screamed about the Long Island murderess, the Witch of Kings Park, the most terrible serial killer in American history. The photograph of Belle Gunness, a severe, no longer young woman, in simple farm clothes covered all the front pages. Her face, expressing neither remorse nor fear, became a symbol of unthinkable cruelty, hidden behind the appearance of an ordinary, hard-working settler. Meanwhile, work on the farm itself unfolded, more resembling an archaeological dig on a battlefield. The police cordoned off a huge area. Criminologists from New York, anthropologists, even pathologists from nearby hospitals were called in. They worked in the open air, in tents pitched right on the frozen ground, in the center of this death camp, on long tables covered with white sheets. They carefully, almost reverently, laid out what could be extracted from the earth. The picture was chaotic and heartbreaking, not complete skeletons, but fragments, charred, shattered, mixed together in the earth. Anthropologists sat for hours over this nightmarish puzzle, trying to separate the bones of one person from another, determine sex, age, height. It was the work of sappers dealing with a death that was old and insidious. "Look here," one of the experts said, showing the sheriff two femoral fragments. "These two pieces, they don't match. Different bone density, different age. These are two different people." And here, he took small foot bones in his hands. "This is most likely a woman. Small, delicate. And this skull." He carefully turned a dark, fractured bone in his hands. A man, around 40, strong brow ridges. But the bones were only part of the horrifying mosaic. Among the ash and earth, personal items were found. Those very things that even the fire couldn't completely destroy. That very buckle the constable had found the first night. Buttons from shirts, metal rivets from work overalls, charred leather wallets in which coins, or folded, charred-edged papers, sometimes miraculously survived. One of the most eerie finds, the burnt remains of a pair of women's shoes with a melted heel and a metal buckle. Each such find was not just evidence. It was a cry from oblivion. It was an attempt by the victim to say, "I was here, I existed," but they could not say their names. And this became the main problem for the investigation. Belle Gunness, during interrogations, behaved with icy calm and complete denial to questions about the bones, the pits, the burn sites. She answered the same thing. "I don't know. It's not my doing. Someone planted them." She claimed that all these people were drifters, hired workers who had left the farm on their own business, where she didn't know. Her sons, broken and intimidated, at first tried to support their mother's line. But under the pressure of evidence and their own consciences, their defense began to crack. Meanwhile, the police tried to establish the identities of the victims. They compiled lists of missing persons from recent years across all of Long Island and New York. They interviewed neighbors, innkeepers, railroad workers, but the problem was that Bella's victims, judging by everything, were people from marginal, unsettled strata of society. Those very drifters, handymen, lonely women who had no relatives to inquire about them. They were shadows in life and remained shadows after death. One by one, the police tried to match the nameless remains to the stories of missing people. Was one of the victims that very Emily Johnson, a maid who had disappeared on her way to relatives 2 years ago? Were these bones, with a powerful frame, the remains of John McCall, a dock worker known for his violent temper and fondness for drink, who had once left a tavern and never returned? But proving anything was incredibly difficult. DNA testing methods didn't exist in those days. Identification was done through scant material evidence, and in rare cases, dental records, if any, could be found. Most of the victims remained without names, simply numbers in the reports. Remains number 1, presumably male, 35 - 45 years. Remains number 7, presumably female, 25 - 35 years. This realization made the tragedy even more bitter. Not only were these people brutally killed, but death itself had taken from them the last thing: their names, their history, their identity. They became statistics in the Belle Gunness case, and meanwhile, the case itself was acquiring new, even darker legends. The press began to circulate rumors that Bella didn't just kill for greed or fear of exposure. Newspaper gossips, lacking access to facts, began to invent tales of ritual murders, witchcraft, that she used the ashes of her victims as fertilizer for her fields. These speculations further confused the picture and overshadowed the main, monstrously simple motive: the lust for profit. The investigation established that many of the missing, whose names appeared on the lists, had either received a small inheritance, sold their meager property, or simply had some savings on them before their disappearance. Bella, with her reputation as a stingy woman greedy for money, obviously saw in these lonely, vulnerable people not potential workers or companions, but walking wallets. She lured them to the farm under the pretext of work or temporary shelter, and then night would fall. That very unfriendly fire would be lit, and another shadow would dissolve in the smoke, replenishing her sinister savings. But to prove this simple and terrifying scheme, they needed more than bones. They needed witnesses. They needed someone who had seen these crimes or knew about them. And the investigation's gaze turned more and more often to the two silent, depressed figures in their mother's shadow, Belle Gunness's sons. They were the key to the solution. But making them talk proved to be the most difficult task. They were not just accomplices. They were prisoners who had lived for years in a hell created by their own mother, and their silence was the silence of absolute, paralyzing fear. The interrogations of Bella's sons, John and Andrew, took place not in station cells, but in a small, stuffy room at the back of the courthouse. The sheriff understood that standard pressure methods wouldn't work on these men. They weren't criminals in the usual sense, but something else: victims, accomplices, prisoners, whose souls had been twisted by years of living in the epicenter of a nightmare. John the Elder resembled a storm-bleached tree trunk, silent, motionless, his hands with thick, gnarled fingers lying on the table like a foreign burden. Andrew the Younger seemed to consist entirely of nerves. He constantly fidgeted with the edge of his jacket, his eyes darting around the room, avoiding the investigator's gaze. From both of them emanated an almost physical sensation of heaviness, as if they were carrying an invisible but unbearable coffin on their shoulders. The sheriff didn't conduct the interrogation alone. With him was a young but perceptive county attorney who played the role of the good cop. He spoke quietly, almost paternally. "John, Andrew, we understand," he began, "that you were under her complete control. She is your mother. You couldn't disobey. But it's all over now. She can't hurt you anymore. Those people we found, they didn't just die. They were deprived of everything, even their names. Help us return their names to them." John remained silent, staring at the table, but his jaw muscles tightened. Andrew swallowed, and his throat convulsed. She always said it was necessary," Andrew whispered, almost inaudibly. "Said they were unreliable, that they would rob us or report on us, or," he fell silent, "or what, Andrew? Or that we would all starve to death if we weren't strong." The word strong hung in the air, taking on a sinister, perverted meaning. Strong through murder, strong through theft, strong through the destruction of their own kind. The sheriff decided to press. "We found the buckle from a belt and a boot and dozens of other things. We know about Otto Sanu. We know he didn't leave. We know you helped dig, helped burn." John jerked his head up. For the first time, a fire flashed in his eyes, not of remorse, but of desperate animal malice. "And what were we supposed to do?" His voice sounded hoarse, like the creak of a rusty hinge. "Disobey her. You don't know her. You don't know what it's like. She would look at you, and you understood that you were nothing to her, meant nothing, like them. All of us for her were expendable. It was the first crack, the first admission, albeit indirect, that those in the pits, had not left, but had been destroyed." "How did it start, John?" the attorney asked softly. "The very first time." Andrew fidgeted in his chair. John stared at the table again. But now his silence was different. He was remembering. Several long minutes passed. "A drifter," he finally forced out. Came in the winter, asked for work. She fed him, let him sleep in the barn, and in the morning, he was gone. She said he died in his sleep. His heart told us to bury him in the far corner. Tell no one, said, that we would be blamed if they found out. And you believed that? Asked the sheriff. John gave a bitter, short, dry laugh. Doesn't matter if we believed or not. We did as she said. Always did. And then there was another. And she didn't talk about a heart anymore. She just said, I don't like him. Get rid of him. And she gave me a crowbar. Silence in the room became thick and sticky, like molasses. The investigators exchanged glances. This was no longer just complicity in concealing a death, but a direct indication of murder. And the fire, the attorney asked quietly. When did you start? Burning. Andrew shook his head, as if swatting a fly, but it was a gesture of despair. After the third or fourth, the earth became soft, too soft in those places, and the neighbors' dogs started digging near our fence. She flew into a rage, said we had to destroy everything completely, so that nothing remained of them, so that no one would ever find them. She said, Andrew's voice dropped to a whisper, that it was like laundry, washing dirty laundry, only with fire. The metaphor of laundry plunged the room into a chilling silence. Murder as a hygienic procedure, destruction of evidence as a household chore. In this lay the whole essence of Belle Gunness. Absolute, total dehumanization of everything and everyone around her. Piece by piece, with agonizing slowness, the story began to flow from these two broken men. They described not outbursts of rage or moments of passion, but a cold, methodical conveyor belt of death. How Bella lured victims with promises of work, shelter, sometimes even feigned friendship. How she studied them, finding out if they had money, relatives who would search for them. How she chose the moment, usually at night, when they were asleep or drunk. The weapon could be anything, an axe, a hammer, a crowbar. The main thing, silence and efficiency. And then began there the son's work. The cleanup, as Bella called it. Dragging the body to a pre-dug pit, dousing it with kerosene or cheap oil, setting it on fire and standing all night, stirring the fire until nothing remained of the person but a handful of ash and a few of the sturdiest bones, which were then crushed and mixed with the soil. Sometimes, if the victim was large, the process had to be repeated over several nights. Hence that acrid, persistent smoke the neighbors had seen. And you never tried to leave, to run away, asked the attorney, and his voice held genuine human bewilderment. John looked at him with an empty, burned-out gaze. And go where? She would have found us. She would have done the same to us. She looked at us and said, flesh of my flesh, blood of my blood. You can't go anywhere. And we understood it was true. We were a part of it, a part of the farm, a part of the land, a part of this smell. It's everywhere. In your hair, in your clothes, in your food. It's inside. You never get rid of it. This was the key admission. They were not just accomplices. They were prisoners, hostages of their own mother, who had created a system of total control based on fear, guilt, and complicity in crimes. They feared her more than the law, more than hell, more than death itself. When the interrogation ended and the sons were led back to their cells, the sheriff and the attorney remained sitting at the table. The air was heavy with what they had heard. "Good God," whispered the attorney, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. This is worse than I could have imagined. She didn't just kill. She created a little hell on earth and made her own children its chief demons. Yes, the sheriff agreed grimly, but now we have their testimony. Now we know how it worked. The most difficult part remains to make her talk, to find out how many there really were, and to understand what kind of woman she is, what's inside her. But making Belle Gunness talk proved impossible. Her silence was stronger than the steel doors of a bank vault. It was her last fortress, and it had to be stormed by other methods. The investigation turned to her past, to the dark and mysterious deaths that had surrounded her throughout her life. And there, new, even more shocking discoveries awaited them. The buried secrets of the old farmhouse were ready to come to light, and they threatened to destroy the already established picture of her crimes, only to create a new, even more vast and terrifying one, while Bella's sons, broken and crushed, were beginning to divulge the terrible details of life on the farm piece by piece. The very building of the Gunness house became an object of intense scrutiny. If the land around held its horrors in the form of pits and ash, the walls of this plain, time-grayed building could hold secrets of another kind, documentary material, those that would shed light not only on the recent years, but on the entire life of this mysterious woman. The investigators obtained a search warrant. Crossing the threshold, they felt the very oppressive atmosphere her sons had described. The house was clean, almost to the point of sterility. But in this cleanliness, there was something unhealthy, strained. The air was stale, and no matter how hard the constables tried, they fancied that very ghostly, sweetish smell of smoke everywhere, as if it had been permanently absorbed into the wood of the walls, the floorboards, the curtains. They acted methodically, prying up floorboards, tapping walls, peering into every crack. Bella, with her manic thrift and suspiciousness, must surely have had a hiding place. And they found it. Not just one. The first was hidden under a loose floorboard in her bedroom, right under the bed, a shallow niche, and in it, an old tin cookie box. Inside, there was no gold, no stacks of banknotes. As everyone expected to find, there lay a collection of personal items. A cheap pocket watch on a chain with a stopped dial. Several pairs of cufflinks, one of which appeared to be made of real mother-of-pearl. A woman's locket in the shape of a silver heart, a leather wallet, empty, but with the initials RL embossed in gold. Each item was carefully wrapped in a separate linen pouch, as if they were dear souvenirs, not trophies taken from the killed. This was not a treasury, but an archive of death, a museum of stolen lives. But the main find awaited them in the basement. The basement was low, damp, cluttered with jars of preserves and old junk. In the far corner, behind a pile of empty sacks, they discovered a niche bricked up. The work was crude. The bricks lay unevenly. The mortar was crumbling in places. The investigators dismantled the masonry. Behind it was not a money stash, but something more sinister. A small space was filled with clothing. Men's work pants, worn to threads, women's dresses of modest styles and dark colors, several children's coats, one of which was very small, for a child of 3 or 4 years old. All the clothing was neatly folded, but on many items, dark, dried stains were visible, which an experienced eye immediately identified as blood. This was a clothing graveyard, silent testimony that the victims were not only adult male workers. The most eerie find in this niche was a small, worn-out notebook. It was not a diary in the usual sense. On its pages, in Bella's even, almost calligraphic handwriting, household accounts were kept, but these were accounts from the Inferno. April 1928. Carl arrived, much strength, gave $2 for a week in advance, worked 3 days, decided to keep $5. The line decided to keep was underlined, and a few lines down, in a different ink color, it said, "Expense, 1 bag of lime, 3 buckets of kerosene." September 1929. Marry with a girl. Paid for a month. Week. The girl coughs. Decided not to delay. And below, expense, extra 2 buckets. Buckle from the girl's shoe, discard. Cannot be cleaned. This was not just a list. It was a balance sheet of death. Bella evaluated her victims like working livestock, their strength, their ability to pay, their potential trouble, and then coldly calculated the expenses for their disposal. Lime to speed up decomposition and mask the smell. Kerosene to burn. In these dry lines lay the whole essence of her monstrous pragmatism. A human life was reduced to a few lines and a couple of buckets of fuel. But that was not all. On the last page of the notebook, written in a trembling, the same hand was a single name, unlike the other entries. It was circled as if in a frame. Anna. Who was Anna? This name did not appear in the missing persons lists or in the sons' testimonies. The sons, when shown the notebook, just exchanged glances and shrugged helplessly. They didn't know any Anna. For them, the name meant nothing. This discovery forced the sheriff and his team to dig deeper into Bella's own past. They began an investigation into her life before moving to the farm in Kings Park. And soon they stumbled upon a new, even darker mystery. It turned out that Belle Gunness had been married twice. Her first husband, a certain Johann Sorge, with whom she had immigrated from Europe, had died 10 years before these events. The official cause, an accident. He fell from a ladder in a barn and broke his neck. The insurance payout after his death was enough for Bella to make a down payment on the farm. Then followed a second marriage to Mr. Gunness himself. He was significantly older than her, owned a small farm. He died 5 years after the wedding. The official cause, a heart attack in his sleep. His will, drawn up a month before his death, left all property to Bella, bypassing his adult children from his first marriage, who vanished without a trace shortly after the funeral, leaving all their belongings behind. There had been rumors in the police at the time, but no evidence. And finally, there was her sister, a reclusive, sickly woman named Anna, who had lived with Bella for several years. Neighbors remembered her quiet, timid. She disappeared around the same time Bella's second husband died. Bella explained then that Anna, unable to bear the grief, had returned to Europe. No one checked these claims. Now the name Anna in the notebook took on a sinister meaning. Was she the first? The one with whom this horror began? A victim that Bella could not forget, and therefore entered her name separately as a memorable milestone on her bloody path. The investigators exhumed the bodies of her 2 husbands. The medical examiner's conclusion was staggering. Traces of a heavy metal, arsenic, were found in Johann Sorge's bones, which had been fed to him drop by drop over years in his food. And on Mr. Gunness's occiput, under his hair, an almost healed mark from a blunt force impact was found, which could have caused a cerebral hemorrhage, mimicking a heart attack. The picture of Belle Gunness's motivation finally became clear with terrifying clarity. This was not an outburst of rage or mental illness in the usual sense. It was a cold, calculating, multi-year strategy. She used murder as a tool. First, to solve family problems and obtain inheritance. Later, as a method of enrichment, put on a production line. She was a predator who saw people, be they husbands, a sister, her own children, or random drifters, only as a resource to be exhausted and disposed of. Her farm was not just a place of murders. It was a factory for processing human lives into capital. And her sons were both slaves in this factory and a living shield and part of the production process. Now, having in hand the sons' testimonies, the material evidence from the house, and the exhumation results, the investigation felt ready to bring formal charges against Belle Gunness. But the most dramatic episode of this case, the trial, where the killer's icy calm would clash with the relentlessness of the law, was still ahead. And it was there that the world was to look into the abyss of her soul and hear what she might say in her defense. The trial of the Witch of Long Island was to be not just a legal procedure, but the final, decisive battle for truth in this kingdom of death she had so long and carefully built. The Riverhead courtroom was packed to capacity. The air hummed with the excited voices of reporters, onlookers, relatives of the missing, whose hopes and fears hung under the high ceiling. In the center of this tense hum, at the defense table, sat she, Belle Gunness. She was dressed in a simple dark dress, her hair pulled into the same tight bun. But what was most striking was her absolute, chilling calm. She looked neither frightened, nor repentant, nor even agitated. Her face was a mask carved from granite. She occasionally turned her head, surveying the room with a cold, appraising gaze, as if she were not the accused, but an outside observer, studying a curious, but generally insignificant occurrence. From the prosecution's side, an impressive wall of evidence was built. One by one, witnesses took the stand. The constable who found the first grave, his hands trembling, showed that very buckle. Neighbors told of the acrid smoke and their suspicions. Anthropologists and pathologists displayed diagrams and photographs, speaking of dozens of exhumed remains, of signs of violent death, of traces of fire. Every word, every exhibit weighed down the scales of justice with a heavy, undeniable burden. But the most dramatic moment was the testimony of her sons. When John and Andrew, pale, with shaking hands, took the witness stand one after the other, a dead silence fell over the courtroom. They spoke quietly, with long, agonizing pauses, their voices sometimes breaking. They told of the first drifter, the crowbar, the laundry by fire, the soul-freezing orders of their mother. John, looking at the floor, uttered his most terrible phrase. She looked at us and said, "Flesh of my flesh, you can't go anywhere." Bella listened to them without a flinch. Not a single twitch crossed her face as her own sons described her as a monster. Only once, when Andrew spoke of the smell that's inside, did her fingers, lying on the table, twitch slightly, as if she were feeling that stench again. It was the only manifestation of anything remotely resembling emotion. When the prosecutor rose to speak, he approached the defense table and placed that very tin box and the battered notebook in front of Bella. Mrs. Gunness, his voice sounded loudly in the silence. These items were found in your home. Are these your trophies? Your souvenirs from the crime scene? And this notebook, is this your bookkeeping? Where a human life is worth 2 buckets of kerosene and a bag of lime. Bella slowly raised her eyes to him. Her gaze was empty and bottomless. I know nothing about these things, she said in her flat, colorless voice. Someone planted them. And the entries in the notebook, this handwriting, it's your handwriting. It is not my handwriting, she replied without batting an eye. Her defense was built on absolute, total denial. Nothing. Never. I don't know. She was a fortress, and storming her proved impossible. She acknowledged neither the material evidence, nor the son's testimony, nor even the exhumation results of her husband's. Everything was fabricated. Everything was a lie. Everything was part of a conspiracy against her. The prosecution's final word was the story of Anna. The prosecutor told of the sister, her disappearance, the name standing alone in the notebook. He didn't assert anything directly, but allowed the ghastly supposition to hang in the air. The first murder might have been committed not for money, but for another, darker reason. Perhaps out of jealousy, a desire for total control, to eliminate someone who knew her too well. Bella didn't react to this either. The name Anna elicited not the slightest spark in her. The trial lasted several weeks, but the atmosphere in the courtroom changed with each day. The initial curiosity and thirst for sensation gave way to a heavy, almost physical horror. People looked at this plain, middle-aged woman and saw not a human being, but something else, the embodiment of absolute, emotionless evil. Her calm was not a defense mechanism, but the essence of her nature. There was not a drop of humanity in her that could be touched, that one could appeal to. The jury retired to deliberate. It didn't take long. Guilty on all counts of murder in the first degree. The recommended punishment, death by the electric chair. When the sentence was read, someone in the courtroom gasped. Someone cried. Belle Gunness listened to it, as motionless as during all the previous sessions. Then she slowly rose and, accompanied by guards, headed for the exit. At the very door, she stopped for a moment and swept the room with her icy gaze. On her face, there was no trace of fear, regret, or anger. There was only one thing: indifference. Absolute, cosmic indifference. It seemed she was looking not at people, but at ants, whose bustle held no meaning for her. Her departure became the culmination of the entire process. She took her secrets with her, the true number of her victims, the reason she started doing this, the name most importantly, the understanding of what truly lay behind that stone mask. She passed into oblivion without ever revealing herself, leaving behind only a trail of inexpressible horror and dozens of nameless graves. Her execution, carried out several months later, was merely a formality, a period in a story that could never be fully read. The Gunness farm was consigned to oblivion, becoming a place even the most daring boys were afraid to tread, and her sons, broken and marked by the stigma of complicity, disappeared into obscurity, carrying with them a part of the hell they had experienced. But the earth, as we know, remembers everything, and even today, decades later, in the silence of the Long Island fields, one might just catch an echo of that distant, unfriendly fire and a soul-chilling whisper, the whisper of shadows that never found peace. The sentence was carried out in the cold, tile-lined chamber of Sing Sing prison. They say Belle Gunness walked her final path with the same icy, unblinking calm with which she had listened to the verdict. No last words, no glance seeking forgiveness, only silence and the same bottomless, empty indifference. It seemed that death itself was for her just another routine procedure, a final cleanup. But with the death of the Witch of Long Island, her story did not fade into oblivion. The Gunness farm became a cursed place. No one wanted to buy the land, watered with blood and ash. Neighbors whose homes were relatively close by moved away, one after another, unable to bear the oppressive atmosphere and the constant reminders, in the form of curious onlookers, reporters, and thrill-seekers who besieged the place. The house and outbuildings themselves gradually deteriorated and fell into disrepair. Local boys, who initially dared each other to run onto the property, would return pale and silent, telling stories of strange sounds, unexplained footsteps in the attic, the creaking of floorboards in the empty house, and sometimes a faint, sweetish smell of smoke appearing out of nowhere on a windless day. A few years after Bella's execution, the main farmhouse burned to the ground under mysterious circumstances. Firefighters never determined the cause of the fire. They said the fire was incredibly fierce and of a strange, almost white color. Bella's sons, John and Andrew, served their sentences for complicity and became ghost-like figures. They changed their names and vanished into the vast country, trying never to remember the years spent on the farm. But can one ever escape oneself? According to unconfirmed rumors, one of them, Andrew, ended his days in a state psychiatric hospital, where he would scream at night to be left alone and beg for the fire to be put out. They became their mother's final victims, their souls twisted and broken long before they entered prison. As for the victims, most of them remained nameless. A few bodies were eventually identified through painstakingly gathered evidence and statements from relatives. But this was a drop in the ocean. Dozens of others were buried in a common, unmarked grave in one of Long Island's cemeteries. A modest monument, erected many years later, reads, "To the victims, whose names are known only to God." That is all the solace they received, and the legend of Belle Gunness is still alive today. She has become part of local folklore, a dark fairy tale used to scare disobedient children. Her image, that of a cold, unemotional woman who saw people merely as a resource, became an archetype, a prototype of the serial killer, utterly devoid of empathy. Historians and criminologists still debate the true number of her victims. Some believe the count could be in the hundreds, and that her criminal career began long before she moved to the farm in Kings Park, driving today along the quiet roads of that area of Long Island. You might come across a wasteland overgrown with weeds and young forest. If you know where to look, you can still find the remains of the stone foundation of that very house and a few half-collapsed bricks from the sheds. Old-timers will point out the spot to you, but advise against getting too close. They say the land there still won't yield, as if poisoned. They say that on the night of a full moon, it becomes very quiet there. No crickets, no night birds can be heard, and if you listen closely, in that ringing silence, you might catch a distant, barely perceptible sound, like the scrape of a shovel against stone and the dull, monotonous crackle of dying embers. The earth remembers. It remembers everything, and it cannot forget.